Why, good morning, everyone. I have not done a video like this in a while. Feels weird, if I'll be honest with you. I've been desiring a lot of Terraria content lately, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. But I decided, okay, maybe I'll just make some content myself. And maybe, hopefully, this can stir up some discussion, because I like discussing this. Hopefully you do too. I wanted to work on a summoner-themed tier list today, and by that I mean literally anything that can deal summon damage, so not just the minions, but whips, some mounts, because not all mounts deal summon damage actually, and a couple of armor bonuses as well. So a lot of tier lists I see usually rate things also depending on how iconic they are and how cool they are, and I totally agree. But if that were up to me, I would let my biases get in the way, and everything is going into S tier. So we do not want to be doing that. I want to rate things based on how useful they are and on how practical they can be. Maybe it'll serve as a guide that can help someone out, perhaps, a little quick reference sheet. So yeah, sure, I'll go ahead and do that. I'll list you my totally objective opinions here. So we're going to start strong with Abigail's Flower, which honestly, without even thinking about it, I'm going to put that into A tier because instead of summoning more minions, Abigail's Flower actually grows with power the more you use it, and that's pretty darn good. In the early game when you first get her, she's actually not as strong as, say, Slimes or Flinx's, but when you put more slots into her, it actually speeds her up and powers her up quite a bit, and for some ungodly reason, she becomes stronger in hard mode, and it actually makes her strong enough to be able to take on bosses like Queen Slime if you are so inclined to do that. It's one of the minions that pair really well with the Firecracker, and considering that, plus that you can actually take her throughout the entire game if you really want to, yeah, that's gonna be it's gonna be an easy A tier. I'm gonna be honest with you. Now, next up is the Ancient Horn, which summons a Basilisk mount, and while the Basilisk is not as fast as, say, the Unicorns, it is actually stronger in combat, it deals more damage, and it reaches its sprinting speed to do damage even faster than the Unicorn does, so less wind-up time, more reliability at the cost of a little bit of speed, and even then, it's fast enough that you can actually give yourself a little bit of leg room against most hard mode bosses if you feel like you really need to. So that honestly probably makes it one of my favorite mounts in the game. Also A tier, honestly. Now, for simplicity's sake, I didn't actually put all of the Old One's Army rods and canes into this list because, I mean, the staffs, even though they're stronger, they still do essentially the same thing, just at different tiers of the game. So that's fine. Now, rating the Ballistae, I think. So they are the slowest of the sentries, especially of the Tavern Keep ones, but they do hit the hardest and they pierce pretty well. And they, along with the other three sentries there, pair really well with their respective armor sets. The set bonuses actually make them more powerful, which is very nice. But while Ballistas used to be, in my opinion, an S tier because you could actually just spam them really reliably and they would fire off immediately. That was really before the days of whips. But since then, they got a slight startup nerf so that you can't spam them. However, they did become stronger overall. I think that when you pile them up enough, especially in the middle of the Old One's army, they all hit hard enough to be able to basically clear a whole lane if they really want to. Not too unlike the actual Dungeon Defender's tower of the same name, although it's actually called a Harpoon Turret if you play the good version of the game. I find it actually pretty reliable, and for that reason, A tier. Well, I guess my bias is going to be getting to me a little bit, huh? So then we can talk about the horse saddles. There are 3 horse saddles that are functionally identical, but they summon different looking horses, really down to personal preference, but they are sold by the zoologist after a certain point, and they can be considered a slightly weaker version of the unicorn. They're considerably slower and do a little bit less damage, I believe, but for pre-hard mode, when you normally get them, they're actually not that bad. I still tend to prefer other mounts over these, but I do find them pretty useful at times. So, for that reason, I will put them in B tier. And, well, there's the second one too, but I'll put the third one in there when I find it, lol. Oh, there you are. Blade Staff, my beloved. I'm going to put you straight into S tier, and I will explain why. This is a hard mode weapon that only deals like a base damage of 6, and that really sounds pitiful, but it ignores a lot of enemy defense, and it attacks very quickly. This minion is one of the reasons why I believe whips were some of the best things to ever happen to Terraria, because tag damage increases minion damage by a flat amount whenever that whip hits an enemy, and for something that hits very fast, very hard, and ignores defense, when you stack multiple whips that have tag damage on them, those blades are going to be shredding everything they touch, and they can do a phenomenal job all the way up to Duke Fishron if you are so inclined to do so. They're not as amazing if you just summon them and leave them alone, especially if you're like not really a summoner and you just want a random minion following you. They're not going to be pulling their weight very much, but when you actually build into them, they are substantially powerful, and I cannot recommend them enough. Huge S tier. Now, the Blessed Apple, I'm not really sure which one, is the unicorn mount. It is an upgrade to all of the horse saddles, but for its point in the game, I think I'm going to put it at a solid B tier because it is one of the fastest mounts in the game and it does do more damage than the horses. I do prefer the Basilisk a little bit better because I find it slightly more reliable. If you need a means of fast travel, you have minecarts, you have teleporters at that point, you have pylons. Really, the most useful thing a unicorn will probably be doing is getting you some distance between yourself and a boss, and that is good. I do appreciate it for that, but the Basilisk also accelerates a little bit faster, so it'll reach top speed in less time than it takes the unicorn. So if you don't have any knockback resistance and you start taking damage before you can speed up your unicorn, you are not going to have a very good time. But still, not a bad mount by any means. I still like it. Who the heck is messaging me? Now, let's talk about the Cool Whip for a second, actually. It used to be a little bit underwhelming back in the day, but after some time, it did get some pretty substantial buffs. It inflicts Frostbite now, which is pretty good. It also actually deals tag damage now. It originally did not beforehand. On top of that, it does summon a little snowflake minion that kind of zips around and smacks things for meager damage, but you know, it's not bad. More damage is still more damage. I find it to be a pretty solid addition to your arsenal, so honestly, I want to put it between A and B, but I think it's going to be very high B tier. Up next on the whip list, we have the Dark Harvest, which is dropped by Pumpkin. So when it strikes an enemy, it gets afflicted with this Dark Harvest debuff, and whenever an enemy gets hit by a minion while it has that debuff, it like zaps this dark energy to nearby enemies for additional damage that ignore a decent amount of defense. The damage is kind of small, but it does add up really quickly, especially with fast-hitting minions like the UFOs. I think it also comes with its own internal 10 tag damage because of that debuff. So I find this to be really amazing for crowd control because there's definitely going to be a lot of invasions that you're going to be fighting in the late game. So honestly, really solid tool for cutting down crowds, as the Scythe probably should be. High A tier. Next up, we have the Deadly Sphere Staff, which looks really cool, and I love its design, but back in the day, it used to be kind of underwhelming. The AI was really bad, still kind of is. It gets stuck around corners and takes forever to actually catch up with you, and it used to do, like, okay damage, but that's only when you were fighting something out in the open. Indoors, it is an absolute no-go. You should never do this. And even then, they weren't usually fast enough to catch up with a player if they were flying around too much. A lot of minions have that issue where they stay in catch-up mode and they just don't really attack until they reach you. But they did fix this to an extent. They gave it static iframes, which let them hit more reliably on top of each other. They will not interrupt each other anymore. And I believe, along with other minions, they made it so that it actually flies faster to catch up with you. So not really a bad pick, if I'll be honest. I'm probably going to put it in mid B tier, something like that. But generally, if you've been playing well enough, you are either going to have another minion that is probably better than it, or you might not actually have it for very long. But once you do, I think it'll serve its purpose, at least for a little while. Give it a try. I think it's pretty good now. Now, the Desert Tiger Staff is a very interesting one. It's really rare. You can only find it from the desert chest in the dungeon post Plantera, so you're gonna have to either get lucky and get a desert key or just grind for like several years. It's kind of like Abigail and Stardust Dragon in the way that it becomes stronger the more times you use it, and for what it does, I think it's actually a pretty solid minion. Its only real weakness is that it doesn't do particularly well against fast flying bosses, which in late hard mode, once you get this thing, that's kind of the norm. But if you're doing farming either on the ground or indoors, like in the dungeon, it absolutely shreds things. The pounce attack does an incredible amount of damage. It can go through walls. It's really useful, surprisingly. It used to be a lot more underwhelming when it was first introduced, but at this moment, I think it's in a pretty okay spot. I think I'll give it a B tier, if I'll be honest. You might use it a little bit for novelty's sake, and that's totally fine. It is still pretty good, but generally you probably have better options available to you at this point. Oh, and if you manage to still keep your Firecracker after all this time, it will pair very well with that. It already does really high damage in like the triple digits, so once it starts letting off Firecracker explosions, yeah, you will be shredding anything you touch, especially those darn pesky paladins, and anything else with a big fat bag of health. So basically, if you're playing Master Mode. Now, Durendal, I'm gonna call it Durendal. This was pretty surprising when I first saw it because I thought it just looked like a regular sword, but turns out no, it is a whip. You get this with hollowed bars, so you have to beat a mech boss for it, and unsurprisingly, with most things made of hollowed bars, it's actually pretty solid. It's kind of like the Snapthorn and the Dark Harvest that give you a bonus buff to your whip attack speed when you strike enemies. I forgot to mention that for the Dark Harvest, by the way, but it does do that. And each of those attack speed buffs are separate from one another, so if you're feeling really inclined, you could actually stack those 3 attack speed buffs and just shred things with whips. Up to you though, it's kind of tricky to do. On top of that, it does have pretty solid damage and range for its tier in the game, and it also gives off a little bit of light with each swing. So honestly, very solid whip. I would be pretty happy to finally get that after a long slog through the early hard mode grind. But yes, I think it definitely deserves its place in A tier. Not to mention the additional tag damage you'll also be applying, which is very, very nice. Your Blade Staff will really appreciate you for it. Now let's talk about the Explosive Trap Staff and its younger brothers. This is unique in that it places a recharging landmine on the ground, and it does blow up in a radius when enemies step too close to it. It can also hit enemies in the air if they're low enough to the ground, but generally that's not going to happen too much. You will generally use this if you want to like spawn camp the portals at the old one's army. You can just stack a bunch of them right outside the exit and enemies will instantly just get decimated by them. It is very useful in that regard, but generally I don't think you're going to be using it that much, especially if you have other sentries that can also fire into the air. If you have the Huntress or the Red Riding armor sets though, it can be pretty cool for a niche fire-based build. I think there's a lot of potential in that, but I have yet to actually play around with that too much myself, but that would be pretty cool. So it's fun to use and has potential, but you generally have better options at this point, so I think that'll make the Explosive Trap our first C tier. Not bad. I still like it, but you have other options. Ah boy, good old Finch Staff. Now that, I have a lot of feelings on this one. It was added in 1.4 as a way to finally have summoners get some easy start to the game without having to grind too much for slimes. But then they made it so that it spawns in a living tree, which is an uncommon structure. It's not guaranteed your world is going to have one, and if your world does have one, it's not guaranteed to have a living wood chest, and if it does have a living wood chest, you only got a 1 in 3 chance to get a Finch Staff. Go figure. Summoners really can't get a break early game sometimes. I kind of feel bad, but it is kind of funny when you think about it. So, obtaining it aside, the Finch itself is, you know, it's what you would expect from an early game summon. It is kind of clumsy, it doesn't always fly too accurately, it might miss its target a few times, and the damage is generally kind of low. You're probably better off doing damage yourself. It is a good help early game, as minions are. I will not take that away from it, but unsurprisingly, you have better options at that point, which would be the Flinx Staff, but that's a story that we'll get to momentarily. But hey, on the bright side, it has static iframes. They won't interrupt each other if you somehow manage to hold on to it long enough until you actually get more minion slot bonuses. If that's the case, I feel bad for you, but hey, solid C tier. I would almost put it in B, but its way of obtaining is way too unreliable to be counted on, shall we say. I like you, Finch, I really do, but unless you're a journey mode character, it is not likely that we'll be meeting very often. Firecracker, finally, this is truly one of the whips of all time, and let me tell you why. The Firecracker is unique in that every enemy that gets hit by it will get this blazing debuff. It will take damage over time from fire, but when minions hit enemies with this blazing debuff, they will explode for 2.75 times the damage that the minion dealt. And for fast minions like the Blade Staff, it is not particularly useful. You're better off using whip tag damage to increase the blade DPS. The Firecracker doesn't have tag damage, so if you pair it with something that hits hard, like Abigail or Pirates, you will see a substantial increase in damage, and its DPS is so strong that if you can increase your attack speed enough to keep up with your minions' attacks, you will see a substantial increase in DPS. It is absolutely wild. It's one of the few summoner items that actually got nerfed at one point, if you can believe it. That is a foreign concept to me. You could theoretically take this to the end game and still be doing numbers with it with your Stardust Dragon or something like that. So from the moment you get it post Wall of Flesh, it will help you claw your way out of the early hard mode log, if you want to call it that. So for that reason, plus its power, plus its absolute longevity, that is going to be an S tier. Amazing whip. We need more stuff like this. Oh, Flameburst Staff. That is a pretty interesting one. It's kind of average, if I'll be honest with you. It stands in one place, it shoots in a straight line occasionally, more often than the Ballistae, sorry, and its projectiles put enemies on fire, which is cool, but like, it's not bad by any means. I think it's good enough to either be low B or high C, something like that, but it doesn't really have anything particularly strong going for it when you have other options available. Is that my dog? However, if you are wearing the Apprentice or Dark Artist armor sets, it will get a pretty noticeable buff. It'll get more range, more field of view, its projectiles gain increased velocity, and the explosions caused by them will actually be larger. So it's actually pretty good if you use those armor sets. So I think I'll go easy on it for really not having that many downsides. I think it'll be a low B. Just why not? Now, a common problem that I hear about summoners is their absolutely slow, painful startup at the beginning of the game, and I totally agree with that. We have to deal with very rare spawns, very rare drop rates, but then we have the Flinx Staff. Finally, an actual reliable method to actually obtain a summon weapon that doesn't rely on RNG, unless you count Flinx spawn rates, I guess. This item is craftable, and that's pretty good. You don't really see something like that every day, at least for my class. On top of that, it was also introduced with an armor piece, which is also really good. So at the very beginning of the game, you can get 2 pretty reliable Flinxes. Their AI is pretty good. They bounce on enemies pretty reliably. If you really want to, you can beat quite a few pre-hard mode bosses with them. Some people even say you could take it to Wall of Flesh. I don't really see why you would when you have better options at that point, but it is there. It's always going to be there if you need a bit of a boost in the early game. And for that reason, it has to be A tier. I love reliability. You don't see that very often, at least back in the old Summoner days. I'm mostly referring to like 1.2.4 or 1.3, but you get the idea. So let it be clear, we're not necessarily ranking armors here, but the Forbidden Armor has a set bonus that summons a Forbidden Sign, and this allows you to cast a Sand Tornado that deals summon and magic damage at the same time. I believe it's affected by both damage types, and because it's affected by magic critical strike chance, it is actually one of the few instances of summon damage outside of certain whips that can actually deal criticals, and that's kind of a rare thing. I think it's pretty interesting. Now, the Sand Tornado will only appear on areas that you have line of sight for, otherwise it'll just get stopped by a wall. And if you summon more than one of them, or if it damages an enemy too many times, it will disappear. So it's definitely not bad, but it's also not particularly amazing either. You mainly use Forbidden Armor for the magic and summon damage bonuses, which is pretty good. I think the magic weapons that you get around that tier are very solid, but that's a story for another day. The actual Sand Tornado itself is nice to have, but you definitely don't need it. You can live without it. I will probably give it a high C tier. Not bad at all, but you probably aren't going to rely on it too much. And if you do rely on it too much by some chance, I would like to introduce you to the Klinger Staff, which probably does the job better. Okay, where were we? Gelatinous Pillion. Man, I love this thing, and I'm going to tell you why. So, the Slime Mount, as you know, the one you get from King Slime, Slimy Saddle, it's really good because it lets you fall faster. It acts like a downwards dash. And the Gelatinous Pillion is functionally kind of the same, but it also allows you to fly a little bit, and it also runs at a slightly faster running speed than the Slime Mount itself, the basic Slimy Saddle, I mean. And as you might be aware, mobility is kind of the king in this game, so being able to move very quickly in different directions is incredible, and the saddle and the pillion are very amazing at doing just that. So I don't really see much of a reason to replace this at all unless you want to use like the cute fish rod or the witch's broom or something. I mean, personally, when I get this, I keep it until the very end of the game. So I'm going to keep it in S tier because it's amazing. And again, one of the few items that ended up actually being nerfed at some point, which is very funny. So the goat skull, this is a very interesting one. Well, functionally it is identical to the unicorn, but it is a master mode exclusive drop from the Wall of Flesh. It is one of the few master mode exclusive summoner mounts, and and the only real difference is that it looks different. That's it. It has the exact same speed and damage as the unicorn mount, and well, depending on your style, in my opinion, I think it looks pretty cool, maybe even cooler. So why not? I'll put it right up there in B tier, right next to the unicorn. Oh boy, the golf cart keys. Need I say more? Okay, I'll say a little bit more. So basically, the golf cart is a little bit tedious to get. You have to get the highest cumulative score from golfing. You can cheese that pretty easily by just throwing a golf ball down into a very far away golf cup. But once you unlock it though, you will be able to buy it from the golfer, and it is a pretty solid mount. It goes at a decent speed, and it's actually unique in the way that it gives you more iframes after hitting an enemy compared to normal. For example, the unicorn mount will give you a 1/10 of a second of invincibility, but in this case, in the golf cart keys case, it is a 1/5 of a second. So it is 0.2 seconds of iframes after hitting something. And if you use that correctly, you can actually go through a lot of dangerous enemies or other obstacles pretty unscathed. And I think that's pretty sick. If you use it correctly, amazing mount. Otherwise, it's okay. Oh, and very important, it comes with headlights. That's pretty cool. Okay, so this one's a little bit hard to see, but it's the Hexxed Branch. It is a Master Mode drop from the Morning Wood in the Pumpkin Moon event, and this one is a very funny mount. It's actually the fastest land mount in the game, and it does an absurd amount of summon damage after running through an enemy. The only downside is that it doesn't have any good vertical mobility at all, and it takes a little bit to wind up its speed, but once you get it going, you can actually outrun basically any boss in the game, as far as I'm aware. And if you are using this on Get Fixed Boy, it is actually very helpful in outrunning the Moonlord and his boulders, especially if you fight him in the underworld, which don't know why you would do that, but I did that, and that was quite the experience. Very solid mount, the speed is hilarious, and you can do a lot of funny things with that. So for that reason, I'm going to put it up in A tier. Its vertical mobility leaves a lot to be desired, but the horizontal mobility more than makes up for it, I guarantee you. So the Hornet Staff, that is quite an iconic weapon, if I'll be honest. It's been around for like a solid 10 years now, maybe even more, and over the years, it's only gotten very minor buffs, but I think it's in a decent place right now, if I'll be honest. The Hornet Stingers only do like a meager amount of damage, but they do inflict poison, which has been buffed in recent patches, and they recently made it so that the Hive Pack actually increases their fire rate by like a whole third, and that's pretty darn good. It's a really funny build that you can go for if you want to just go for like a swarm build with V armor and such. So while it's not the metagame Vampire Frog build, I will give it some credit for being still pretty reliable after all these years. So I'm going to put it in like mid B tier. So this little guy is the Houndius Shootius. It is a drop from Deerclops, and it is generally probably going to be the first sentry that a player is going to obtain at any given point. It's very basic in its functionality. It looks at something and it shoots a straight projectile every second or so that does some damage. Doesn't have any other special effects, but I don't think it really needs to. Having an early sentry is actually really good for early game invasions and can help keep an area under control during any kind of fight. If you use it correctly, you can even do some decent damage against bosses as well. And if you manage to get any of the accessories that the Dark Mage drops from Old One's army, you can have 2 of these. And honestly, that's pretty good. And even then, this can actually be an early pre-hard mode weapon if you actually know how to go for it. You can literally just beeline for the Deerclops somehow, some way, and if you die, well, he doesn't despawn for a while, so you can just ram yourself right back into him, keep throwing yourself against a wall until eventually he breaks down, and with that, you'll basically get yourself a free weapon, possibly even a free sentry. So I think I will put this right up here in the middle of B tier for being pretty reliable at that stage in the game. It will get outclassed pretty quickly, but that is totally fine. It serves the purpose that it needs to serve, and I like it. So the Imp Staff is an interesting one. It used to be really slow back in the day, and it did a little bit more damage. That has been kind of evened out after a certain patch, so it's a little bit more reliable at the cost of some of its damage, but I think its overall DPS increase is better. In my opinion, I feel like it competes with the Vampire Frogs in terms of late pre-hard mode DPS, and I think it has its niche though. It does have the fastest velocity of pre-hard mode minions as far as I'm aware. The on-fire effect is pretty darn good. It's pretty good at hitting things from long range, which the Vampire Frog cannot do. So I think it is a solid pick. Even if you just have one in your party, having the on-fire debuff is pretty darn helpful. I think it makes a pretty good addition to a pre-hard mode team, even if Vampire Frogs are most likely better at handling Wall of Flesh. I will actually give this a solid B tier, although I think I'll move the Deadly Sphere Staff up a little bit, since it can be a lot more helpful in the stage of the game that it's in. Oh, I see the list has gotten a little bit bigger and taken up more of the screen, so I might have to scroll down a little bit. Oh well. I'll be posting a picture of the whole tier list once I'm done with this video, so don't worry. Kaleidoscope. S tier. I don't think I really need to explain this one. It is the best whip in the game. It's the latest one that you can get at this moment. The next update will add more whips, and I'm sure it'll get outclassed at some point. But for now, this is the best whip in the game. It has the highest damage, the highest crit chance. Although, no, I think I might be wrong. I think the Morningstar's crit chance is a little bit better. But it is extremely reliable, and every late game summoner should have one of these. For the most part, it is basically uncontested. And it looks nice too. So let's talk about the leather whip. Poor guy. He can be obtained as soon as you get the zoologist. I believe it costs 10 gold, and that is fine. It is the first whip in the game. It's the first one you're ever going to get. Except it's not, because it's a lot easier to just dive into the jungle and get yourself a Snapthorn. It doesn't really take that long to get those materials. The leather whip is substantially weaker and has lower tag damage. The only real reason I could imagine wanting to invest in this is so that you can have more whips to stack tag damage on. That is pretty useful for the early game, but otherwise, you can definitely skip this one and not regret it whatsoever. I'm gonna have to put this one in D tier. Rest in peace, little guy. This is our first D tier for the day. Maybe even our only one. Who knows? I do remember that it has been buffed a little bit to be a little bit more available at earlier points in the game, but generally, 10 gold is still quite a bit to spend on something, and the zoologist doesn't show up until you've completed a certain amount of the bestiary anyway, and you could easily spend that bestiary time going through the jungle and finding all those enemies and getting all the materials for the Snapthorn. It's not that difficult. So this is the Lightning Aura Staff. This actually is very interesting. It's a very niche sentry that summons an area of effect lightning aura, kind of like in Dungeon Defenders. Well, duh. It does very consistent damage to any enemy that goes through it, and it does this by adding the enemy's defense to the damage total, so that way it stays consistent no matter what it's hitting. If you are wearing the monk or shinobi armors, this actually can hit faster, and its area of effect gets wider, and it is one of the few sources of summon damage that can do criticals without a whip. It might not be particularly amazing for regular enemies unless you want to just spawn them right in front of the portal in the old one's army, but if you are to like lure bosses into it, I think it can actually do very consistent damage, especially if you like fight Plantera with this thing. You will be doing a lot of damage to it, so good choice in my opinion. I am going to put this at least in the middle of B tier for being pretty darn solid for what it does. Yeah, that'll do it. The Lunar Portal Staff. This is quite something. It's kind of hard to rate endgame post-Moonlord items because generally by the time you get them, you don't really need them anymore, but I will say without a shadow of a doubt that this, in my opinion, is the best sentry in the game. I'm going to put it up here before I even mention anything else. It got a substantial buff in recent times, and honestly, I'm not even sure if it even needed it. It sweeps very quickly, it does a lot of damage, and in that patch, you can also have it shoot 2 lasers at once, which is crazy. The area control of this thing is ridiculous, but I guess for something that shares the drop pool with like the last prism and the lunar flare, I think it deserves it. It's very, very strong. Like once you get this thing, you really will not need any other sentry at that point. Rainbow Crystal is cool and everything, but I don't think it compares as much in terms of raw DPS, but I guess we'll get to that one in a moment. So this is the Morningstar. It is post-Plantera. You can get it from the dungeon. It is actually ridiculously strong at the time that you get it. Like, I was really surprised when I rolled up to the dungeon on my first 1.4 run, and this thing told me it did like 300 summon damage or something, and I was like, whoa, excuse me? And I think it even got a semi-decent buff in recent times too. I think it also got a small nerf, but I don't entirely remember what it was at the moment. Not only is it the first whip that can actually let minions do tag criticals, which is pretty huge, it on its own is very good at self-defense. It is a slow but very strong slap in the face to any enemy that you come across, and it has really decent knockback. It really just keeps you safe. It has a slightly lower tag damage value than other whips as far as I remember, but it does a lot of damage on its own anyway, so I cannot fault it. It is very good. I'm going to put it in A tier. Oh, the Optic Staff. This is a very interesting one. I have a lot of history with this thing. It is very cool that you can literally just summon miniature minions, twinions perhaps? But back in the day, it used to be kind of underwhelming. It is really good for what it does, even back then, but it was not very good at catching up with you, and eventually the twin minions would start interrupting each other because of iframes, so they just really weren't as good in large numbers. But that has been rectified in recent updates. The lasers don't pierce, and I believe the spasmatism charges have less iframes now, and they made it so that, along with other weapons like Deadly Sphere, they will catch up to you quickly if you're flying quickly. So this is a pretty pretty solid weapon overall. You don't necessarily need it, especially if you find yourself a Sanguine Staff, but if you just want raw numbers, if you really want to go for that swarm build, this can work, and it is really good against bosses like Destroyer and Plantera, so I will definitely put it in B tier. Maybe I'll move that over a little bit. Yeah. Pirate Staff, I kind of feel bad for it sometimes, if I'll be real with you. It used to be kind of underwhelming. It did get a pretty good damage buff at some point. I think it does 40 base damage right now. But the pirates used to have a really bad AI, and they would just run off and not target freaking anything. That has been fixed though, so for a basic grounded summon, it is not bad. But you have so many better options at that point. You have the Blade Staff, you have the Spider Staff, which inflicts a debuff. It's better at holding on to targets. You have the Sanguine Staff, which is before any hard mode boss. For this, you just have to hope that you get lucky from pirates, which is fine, but out of all of the early hard mode summons, this one has to be the least reliable in terms of mobility. It is not particularly amazing. I almost want to put it at like the top of C tier, but if you pair it with Firecracker, then it actually has a lot of brute force behind it. Like, you will hit things very hard. It's just going to have trouble hitting things that are faster than it. So like, I can't tell if I want to put it at the bottom of B tier or like the top of C tier. I suppose most old minions have that AI problem. Usually the newer ones are a lot more reliable in that regard, and that's why I always use them nowadays, so I just can't really see myself using the Pirate Staff anymore, but I don't know. I suppose it depends on the build you want. If you are just going to summon one minion and you're not a summoner and just kind of leave it alone, yeah, you can use a Pirate Staff, but if you have a swarm, you can probably achieve a lot more DPS with any of the other aforementioned minions. Well, I suppose it has its niches, but I guess in its overall usefulness, I will just leave it at the very top of C tier, which kind of makes me feel bad, but, you know, biases aside, I do have to see things for what they are. Pygmy Staff, it is post-Plantera. It summons a bunch of little tiki dudes that throw spears at a pretty good velocity. They inflict venom. Pretty solid pick for a grounded minion. I think it might be one of the last grounded minions you ever get in the game, but for what it does, it's actually pretty nice. For particularly slower targets like Golem, Plantera, maybe even some Solar Eclipse enemies, it's actually pretty darn good. The spear throwing velocity has been increased at some point, so it's not nearly as like clunky as they used to be, but for at least a very small portion of the game, it is definitely quite usable. You will probably find something better once you get the Desert Tiger or some other minion of that tier, but I actually find it quite nice to have some pygmies on me. I like them. I think it'll be in B tier. So Queen Spider Staff is an old sentry. It's been around for quite a while without really receiving that many changes, as far as I remember. I guess it got a slight damage buff, maybe some knockback at some point. For an early hard mode sentry, I actually kind of like it. It's pretty solid, and it spits out eggs that crack open into multiple baby spiders, and each of them do their own instance of damage, which is pretty solid, and each of them inflict venom also. It really helps maintain crowds in hard mode, at least in the early stages, which is probably something you're gonna need, especially if you fight something like Queen Slime, which has an obnoxious amount of minions. You're usually gonna want some crowd control to even out the numbers. The Queen Spider has withstood the test of time, and I almost never skip it because it's just really nice to have. So that'll be a B tier. I think the only thing probably holding it back is that the eggs are like lobbed. They're affected by gravity, so they drop off after a pretty short distance. But other than that, when it does hit, it does hit. It does pretty good damage. Rainbow Crystal Staff. This is kind of a hard one if I'll be honest with you. It's on the exact same tier as the Lunar Portal Staff. It is dropped by Moonlord itself, so you're not really going to use it much after you get it unless you want to just hang around and build something or just have fun with your new weapons. Do whatever. I'm really biased for this weapon. I really love how it looks. The crystals are very pretty. The rainbows are very cool looking, but you're probably not going to be using this as often as the Lunar Portal. I know that it's been buffed at some point to be more reliable, so it hits things faster, but it is still very possible for something to avoid it if it's fast enough. I'm probably going to put it at the top of B tier though. For what it is, it's pretty cool, but you have a better option right there. Oh, Raven Staff has been through quite a bit of change in the past few years. It used to be kind of slow, and the Ravens used to like interrupt each other, and they used to not be able to catch up with enemies very well, or with you very well. The only thing it really had going for it was pretty okay damage, and that's about it. But after a bit of a glow up in the past few updates, I think it's actually gone through a little bit of a redemption arc. I kind of want to put it either at the bottom of A or at the top of B. Either way, if you go for a Raven Staff right after beating Plantera, you are going to have very strong minions with you that can help you shred other invasions, including Martians, which can help you get the Xeno Staff. I know it competes pretty roughly with a weapon of that caliber, but you can get the Raven Staff earlier, and as a result, you can do pretty good against other bosses like Empress and Duke, etc. So honestly, it's been kind of slept on. Give it a try. Pretty good A tier. Sanguine Staff is an S tier. This is not even a contest, it is not a debate, and I'm going to explain why. The Sanguine Bats are probably the most reliable summon in the game. They never miss their attacks, they always stay right by your side. They pair well with the Firecracker hits, they pair well with tag damage, they have just the right amount of attack speed to be able to pair well with any whip, essentially. They have a pretty good range, and they have pretty good damage for the stage of the game that you find it in, which is, by the way, literally beginning of hard mode before any mechanical boss. You do have to fight Dreadnoughtalus to get it. It is a tough boss, but once you get that down, you will have yourself a minion so strong it can carry you to almost the rest of the game if you really, really want to do that. It is honestly good enough to be able to take on Plantera and Golem. Even if the damage itself is not particularly amazing with just maybe one of them, for example, the fact that they are so reliable and they home in on any target without fail makes them so hard to pass up. I mean, you'd basically be shooting yourself in the foot if you just didn't go after this weapon. You can achieve better results with the Blade Staff if you really build into it. It requires a lot more maintenance. These guys will always perform perfectly no matter what. And even after its nerf, a very slight one I might add, it is still easily one of the best summons in the entire game. It's kind of weird when I think about it because there's like other weapons of different classes at this tier that are just as good, if not better. So whenever Summoner actually does get a good weapon, I think, oh no, do I even deserve this? This is like way too good for me because I've just been conditioned to be okay with subpar weapons for the most part. But no, Summoner's been getting a wonderful facelift lately. Very happy with it. I just had to get that tangent out of the way. Thank you, Sanguine Staff. Really appreciate it. Okay, let me talk about the Slime Staff for a second. If it were up to me, I would put it in S tier just because of how iconic it is. In my opinion, this is the king of summon items. This is what started basically everything, as well as the Pygmy Staff and the Frost Hydra, but you know, different story. It's incredibly rare, it's incredibly iconic, but like I said, it's really rare. You are almost never going to get something like this unless you're either lucky or you purposefully go out of your way to farm slimes for a very long time. Thank you, slime statues, for allowing us to do that. Maybe I'll put it at the top of B tier, if I'll be objective here. The damage itself is pretty good. It is noticeably better than the Finch Staff by quite a mile, actually, but it is so incredibly rare. There's no reliable way to obtain it without a slime statue farm, but it does exist. It is there. Kind of, unless it doesn't want to be. But if you do manage to get your hands on it early enough, it's actually pretty solid, and I think it competes with the Flinx Staff quite a bit. Even then, actually, the Flinx and the Slime do not interrupt each other when it comes to iframes, so you can actually have one of each, and you'll actually be doing a little bit more DPS, I think. So I think they make a pretty good team. I would say maybe paired with a Vampire Frog as well, but I think at that point it might be better to just have like 2 frogs or something, maybe more. But yeah, Slime Staff, awesome. Love you. I think I'll put you at the top of B. So earlier we talked about the Gelatinous Pillion, which is just the objectively better Slimy Saddle. So now that we are the Slimy Saddle, I think it'll be a pretty easy pick to just like put it in A tier somewhere. Yeah, right around there is fine. It has the exact same downwards dash as the Flying Slime Saddle, but it has noticeably less mobility. It doesn't walk as fast, and it can't fly, obviously, but it does have pretty good jump height. It's good. You could keep this until the end of the game if you want to, but if you get your hands on Gelatinous Pillion, there's basically no reason not to use it. So, very solid. I'm glad you're here. Earlier as well, we talked about the Leather Whip and how it basically stands almost no chance against the Snapthorn. Well, here's the Snapthorn. I'm going to put it right here because it is an early game whip that you can get basically as soon as you get enough jungle materials. It's not locked behind any progression. It has more damage, tag damage, and range than the Leather Whip. It inflicts poison, a pretty darn good poison, unlike the Leather Whip. And it's one of the 3 whips, along with these 2, that have the whip attack speed buff after striking an enemy. So if by some chance you really feel like pairing all these 3 up and hitting things, you're going to be attacking really freaking quickly. Even in late pre-hard mode, it helps to pair this thing with like the Spinal Tap or something, because you can actually hit something with the Snapthorn and then immediately switch to your Spinal Tap, which will do more damage and DPS thanks to the attack speed. It's just really darn good. It did get a slight nerf that slightly like decreases the attack speed and the poison chance per hit, but that doesn't really stop it. It's a very solid pick. I would say it's one of the most essential whips in the early game, honestly. I guess you have to scroll down a little bit again. Okay, Spider Staff. This is quite a very useful summon weapon. It's going to be a lifesaver if you get it early enough. I mean, you should. You should get it as soon as you enter hard mode, unless you want to opt for using a really souped up Abigail, in which case, more power to you. That's a great option as well. The Spider Staff has gone quite a long way in the past few years. The spiders cling onto enemies, they inflict venom, which is very freaking strong. It's very good against Queen Slime. They're pretty good against the twins and even Skeletron Prime if you know how to use it correctly. And the 3 colored variants of the spiders don't actually interrupt each other very much when it comes to iframes, so I actually really respect what it does. It is kind of peculiar how the iframes work, but maybe we'll get into that some other time. This is going to be an A tier because of how much of basically a keystone weapon this can be, in my opinion. So yeah, it might do a little bit less base damage than the Pirate Staff, but it is far more reliable, and that damage over time is nothing to sneeze at. Give it a try. Spinal Tap. It kind of looks like a bone pickaxe from down here. This is one of the best pre-hard... No, sorry. This is the best pre-hard mode whip as of the time of making this. I'm definitely going to be putting it right up here along with the other really good whips. This is very unique. It does not have the attack speed boost that the other whips have, but it's kind of unique in the way that it can pierce multiple enemies with a lot less damage drop-off. There's certain weapons in the game that pierce enemies, but the more enemies they hit at once, the less damage it'll do to each subsequent enemy. This is not very effective by that drop-off. And you know what kind of challenge has multiple entities you have to hit? The Wall of Flesh, the Old One's Army. You'll be hitting a lot of targets with decent damage, decent tag damage, and if you pair this well with minions like frogs, maybe even imps, you can and will do a lot of damage to the Wall of Flesh. I used to have a lot of trouble beating Master Mode Wall of Flesh as a summoner back in early 1.4, but when they introduced the Spinal Tap, this was my answer. This just cleared all of my worries. This, especially if you're using obsidian armor, is an absolute pub stomp that I would say is almost on the same level as like the meteor armor and the space gun. Maybe even higher than that, since that seems to do a lot more DPS than the space gun in the first place. Spinal Tap, huge no-brainer, amazing whip. Love it. So Staff of the Frost Hydra is a very interesting one. It has gone through quite a few changes over the years, so it's been made to be more reliable, it inflicts frostbite, it can pierce an enemy now as far as I'm aware, and on top of all that, it hits pretty darn hard. I feel kind of tempted to put it at the bottom of A tier if I'll be honest with you. It is one of the final sentries that you're going to get in the game, but it does its job pretty well. It might feel like its attack rate is kind of slow, but its damage output is pretty solid. I give it a strong recommend. It is definitely worth the grind for the Frozen Key, which I try to do on every summoner run. Besides, it's been around since Summoner's conception back at 1.2, so I can't not give it credit for that. Thanks for being an OG. Moving on to the Stardust Cell Staff. This is a tough one for me. The Stardust Cells are very unique. They are very smart. They automatically shoot at anything you're attacking. They basically never miss. They inflict a unique debuff, and it does a lot of damage over time. It's really cool. I really like this weapon. However, it is also very hard to justify using it when it sits in the shadow of its twin brother, the Stardust Dragon. However, that does not stop me from giving it a strong recommend. If you want something that is fast and reliable and does not get distracted easily like the Stardust Dragon, then the Stardust Cell Staff might just be the weapon for you. You will not hit really big numbers with it like you will with the Stardust Dragon, but a swarm of cells is going to be able to focus on multiple targets at once, and will even do notably bigger damage against larger single targets like bosses. Either way, it is going to melt whatever you attack, but a lot of people tend to use the Stardust Dragon anyway because of its very big numbers. So I think part of the reason why people feel kind of torn between these two, or at least I do, is because what are you going to fight with these weapons? The Pillars, the Cultist, and the Moonlord. That is, if you die to Moonlord and you need to go through the Cultist again. You know what I mean. The Moonlord consists of multiple very large health entities, and you need lots of big damage numbers to reliably take it down. The Stardust Dragon does exactly that. As long as you have it focused on a single point, it will do insane DPS to anything it shreds. It does even more DPS than the Terraprisma if you can actually land some criticals using the Kaleidoscope or the Morning Star. At that point, you'll be easily doing like 1,000 damage per hit, and that's insane. Its biggest fallback, however, is that it does get prone to distraction. It will probably fly away. It might lose attention on what you're trying to fight, and especially if you're running away from Moonlord and you're trying to keep distance between you and him, the dragon might not actually attack what you're trying to point at unless you're close enough. Terraprisma does not really have that problem, and neither do Stardust Cells, now that I think about it. I will put both of these weapons in A tier, with Stardust Dragon probably being a little bit higher, because despite its drawbacks, those huge freaking numbers are nothing to sneeze at. Oh, and I should mention that the dragon itself is the only minion that can actually detect enemies through walls. Terraprisma can too, but it only does that once it's actually attacking something within its line of sight. So that's pretty cool. But when you equip a full set of Stardust armor, you get rewarded with the set bonus of the Stardust Guardian. It is a free minion, it does not cost any slots, and it will move in and rapidly punch anything that gets too close to you. The DPS itself is fine, it will not carry you through boss fights or anything, but the hits are rapid enough to be able to stun lock almost any non-boss enemy that gets in your way. However, by that point, you will probably have very strong minions like the Stardust minions or the Terraprisma, which will do substantially more DPS than the Stardust Guardian. Of course, you don't really want to rely on him alone anyway, he's just there to supplement your DPS, but on its own, I think it's fine, though that's about it. He's just fine. But he is, of course, way better than he used to be back then, when he used to do like one AoE attack every second or so, which did very meager damage. Now, at least he has more respectable DPS. His detection range isn't amazing either, however, so do keep that in mind. He's mostly there as a bodyguard to keep something off your back. So that being said, pretty solid B tier. Oh yeah, well, he can also detect enemies through walls. I did forget about that, but usually you're probably not going to have any problems with that unless you're mining or building, and it's actually pretty good to have him around when you're building. I appreciate it. So up here we have the Tempest Staff. This is dropped by Duke Fishron, and it used to be the strongest summon item in the game for a time, but it has very easily been outclassed ever since 1.3 rolled around, and for pretty good reason, because Xeno Staff is pretty freaking busted. That being said though, it has received some decent buffs over the years. The tornadoes move faster to catch up with you, the velocity of the projectiles are faster, so it's really not a bad pick to have this on you. Chances are though, you might already have something better like the Xeno Staff, and honestly, it kind of competes with Ravens as well. Even though Ravens are melee minions and they don't have any projectiles, I do find them a little bit better at chasing targets. Sometimes you will probably find the Sharknado minions to be firing a lot and missing a lot of their shots unless something is stationary or very close to them. So its reliability is a little bit questionable, I suppose, but I will probably put it at a medium B tier. Perhaps? I'll move it up over here, actually. It is still raw damage. It is pretty darn respectable. You just need to be in a good position where it can actually hit reliably. Alright, so let's talk about the elephant in the room. I don't think I really need to justify myself, but if you desire, I will say that the Terraprisma is the best summon weapon in the game. I mean, that's pretty uncontested. I think at most it competes with the Stardust Dragon because it does do better numbers, but the Terraprisma is similar to the Sanguine Staff in that it never misses, it always stays by your side, it never gets distracted, it just does what it needs to do, it zooms off, clears the whole screen of enemies, and then it comes back and repeats. Granted, you do have to defeat a very difficult boss, Empress of Light, without taking any hits during the day, and I think that is a perfectly fine reward. Summoner is all about dodging, and I think this, as a reward, encapsulates that philosophy perfectly. Besides, Empress herself is like the best designed boss in the game, but I suppose that's another story. So Terraprisma, incredibly strong. Once you have it, there's really no reason to have anything else unless you want to mess around with Stardust Dragon, but I guarantee you, this will make the Pillars and the Moonlord and any other challenge at that tier an absolute breeze, especially if you manage to get this one right after Plantera. The rest of the game is just a cakewalk. That's just how it is. And honestly, that's pretty cool. I wouldn't have it any other way. I love the Terraprisma. So moving on, back in the early hard mode region, we have the Black Spot. This is a master mode drop from the Flying Dutchman of the Pirate Invasion. It used to be really freaking broken in that it could fly ridiculously fast, but that has been severely nerfed, and now it just exists as a slow but kind of cool infinite flying mount. It's one of the only mounts in the game that has infinite flight, and you don't normally see something like that until like the late game, but as early as the beginning of hard mode, that's really not bad. However, you are probably not going to be escaping any bosses with it. I could be very wrong. I'm sure there's people out there that can kite with this mount pretty darn well, but unless you're building or exploring or something to that nature, you are probably just going to be using the Gelatinous Pillion instead. For that reason, I think I'll be putting this like towards the bottom of B tier. Vampire Frog Staff. I love this thing. I love frogs. The frogs are so freaking good. It used to be a lot more difficult to get back in the day, and it was pretty underwhelming once you actually did get your hands on it, but it has been buffed pretty substantially, and despite being a pre-boss minion, it is still good enough that you can take all the way to the Wall of Flesh, and it might actually be the best minion for Wall of Flesh. It hops constantly, its mere existence is a hitbox that does constant damage, it pierces. Like, you only really need a couple of these things, since they do have the static iframes that could interrupt each other after you have enough of them, but Other than that, such a solid minion. Once you get your hands on this thing, like literally every other pre-hard mode boss is just a joke. It's really good. It takes a little bit of patience to get, but once you get your hands on this thing, you will see the fruits of your labor. These things will shred bosses, at least in the early game. And Wall of Flesh is no exception. Pair that with Spinal Tap and Obsidian Armor, and, well, you'll see what I mean, trust me. And last but not least, on our Summoner tier list, we are going to bring in the Xeno Staff, which is one of the most reliable minions in the game. So you get it from the Martian Saucer, not sure if you could tell, but its ability to teleport to things and zap them instantly with lasers makes this thing almost unavoidable. I have seen people say that it never misses, but in my experience that isn't entirely true. I have in one instance seen it try to hit something that was hiding under some blocks, and the laser just kind of hit the block and didn't actually attack the enemy. It was kind of weird, but that's a very specific circumstance, so you're probably not going to be encountering that all too often. This thing flies pretty quickly, it teleports to enemies, it zaps them repeatedly, and even after a nerf or two, it still remains as one of the best minions in the whole game. Even if you're just near bosses, it's just going to do constant passive damage, and even then it's not really that passive, it's pretty darn aggressive. For that reason, I'm going to put this at the bottom of S tier. And I think that's it. I think that's the whole list. I will be putting this up on screen. This is the officially unofficial Terraria Summon Weapons tier list by yours truly. This was actually pretty fun to make. It does actually take a little bit more effort than I thought it would because I need to get over my freaking stuttering, but I did have a lot of fun with this, and I hope you did too. If you want to see more things like this, then just let me know and I might just consider it. That being said, I unfortunately have to go to work, so I will wish you a good rest of your day, and if you have any thoughts, opinions, and disagreements, please let me know. I would love to talk. Alright, thanks for watching, and I wish you well. Bye.